So if you were the superintendent of Houston, or you know Texas data pretty well, the commissioner of education in Texas, and you were going to work on one thing over the next 5 to 10 years around improvement of public education, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I would be inspired by those kinds of comparisons. A lot you can do in 5 years. I mean, most of the improvements that you have seen here are achieved in a level of 5, maybe 10 years, and that's still a good trajectory. If I have to choose one thing that I can do in the short term, and that's about getting standards right, it's making sure that these expectations that are placed on every student are really, really high. They're well aligned with what we see in the best performing systems around the world. If we could, and then that's, I think, a quick win. I mean, most countries have put those systems in place very quickly. If I could do a second thing, I would address the hard part, and that is to invest in the teaching profession, to make sure that I attract, develop, and retain teachers. And again, I may not have more money to do that, but certainly what I could do is actually make teaching careers more flexible, shift resources from maybe smaller classes into offering teachers more time for other things than teaching, building professional capacity, working with other teachers. I think there's a lot of scope for change that doesn't necessarily cost more money. But I admit that's the harder part. We talked about probably a 5-10 years agenda, whereas on the issue of standards, I think you can achieve that really, really quickly. Well, let me start by this. I think the best way for Texas to make money is to actually invest in the children and educate them well. The long-term economic success is going to be many, many times more powerful than... I actually have some data on this. If the United States would improve its education performance by 25 points on the PISA scale, which is not a lot, this is more or less what we've seen in Poland or Germany or countries like this, you are talking about $100 billion US in long-term economic gains from that. I mean, the cost of reform, the cost of improvement is a tiny fraction from the economic gain. That doesn't sort of answer your question. I mean, making teaching more sort of selective is very, very important, but you're not achieving this alone simply by sort of regulating entry, because you just choke off supply unless you change the work organization. What drives actually getting great people into this? Of course, a selective entry to the profession, but more importantly, giving people a great career, giving them sort of opportunities to evolve. If you tell a 25-year-old person, you're going to be a mathematics teacher in this school, and 25 years from now, you're still going to be a mathematics teacher in this school, you're not attracting the kind of people you want to become your best teachers. The second part I have to this is, yes, entry to the profession is very, very important, but even more important is continued investment in the profession. Now, you can't sort of, if you get a great teacher and drop that teacher in a poor system, the system wins every time. It's about changing the work organization, ensuring that there are opportunities for professional development that help teachers grow in their careers. And that's, I think, it's not about, if you would say, well, it all depends on whom I get into my teacher college, you're basically saying that you can't change anything in the next 20, 30 years because you're only going to replace a few teachers every year. It's the investment in the teachers that are already there that's the most promising track. And actually, the example of Ontario, Canada, is a great example for where this happens. They have had a similar problem of entry into teaching college, not very selective, but they have been very, very good at mobilizing talent in their profession, giving those teachers who demonstrate better capacity opportunities to actually contribute to the system. One benchmark is to compare it with other professions, and what I can tell you is that in the industrialized world, our countries invest 15 times more in medical research than they invest in educational research, despite the fact that both consume similar amounts of public spending. And that tells you something about the profession. In education, we really believe sort of it's more an issue of beliefs, of practices, rather than of being evidence-driven. That being said, I think the United States does rather well compared to other countries in its relative investment in educational research. My concern, my criticism would be more that that kind of research often doesn't relate very strongly to actual teaching practice. It's sort of disconnected from what actually happens in classrooms, and improving that link, I think, is probably where you can actually leverage a lot of impact. much of the educational research is something that teachers don't relate to, that they can't translate into improvement of professional practice. And I think that's where I think most things could be gained. Very, very good question. Now, of course, very, very different practices across countries on this. Let me sort of make the furthest stretch, and that's if you go to the Nordic countries in Europe, if you go to Finland, to Sweden, to Norway, to Denmark, there you have really full integration. But what is really interesting is they wouldn't use the term special needs for disabilities. Virtually every student in the education system will become a special needs student at some point in their career. Special needs could well be special talents, you know. Special needs means here the education system, through more investment, can actually make a greater impact. So actually it's not a labeling and stigmatizing effect of someone who has a problem, but someone where the education system can make more of a difference. In Finland, 30% of instruction time for every teacher, every school, is delivered outside formal classroom settings. You actually have a lot of means, a lot of resources to actually foster special talents or actually counter disadvantage or attend to special needs. That, I think, is sort of the furthest stretch, the furthest approach to integration. Then you have everything in the middle, and you have still some countries that have actually still quite important segregation for students with special needs. Very important question. In fact, you know, on the 25th of June, we are publishing our first study on this. We did the world's largest survey of teachers where we measured for the very first time teacher self-efficacy. Effectiveness, you know, that's sort of a stretch. That's something where we would have needed outcome data. We can connect it to PISA, but on the self-efficacy, you do see big variation across teachers, across countries, which tells you, know, this is as much a system issue than it is an individual issue. A lot of variability. You also see how self-efficacy relates to opportunities for continued professional development. Teachers that actually were regularly participating in professional development, actually demonstrating higher sense of self-efficacy. A lot of variability, but the study is only going to come out in June, and then we'll have to do a lot of further analysis with this. But it was very instructive. I mean, you know, I would have expected a lot of variation between teachers, but not as much variation across systems. And the latter tells me really that there seems a lot we as educators and also the policymakers can do a lot to shape outcomes, such as teachers' sense that they can actually make a difference.
Give an example of some things we can do in terms of changing teacher efficacy.
Yeah, you know, one of the things is what you see is that in North America, you have a lot of teachers who believe that, you know, education essentially is an innovation hostile environment. If I do something that is new, that is different, I'm rather getting penalized than getting rewarded for this. And I think that environment depresses self-efficacy. And that basically says, you know, I'm just a little wheel in a big machine. Giving teachers, creating more room for professional autonomy, but in a collaborative culture. Classroom observation is very strongly related to self-efficacy, where teachers actually watch what other teachers are doing, when there are professional learning opportunities. There are many, many ways in which you can sort of shape that kind of.
And these are low cost.
Low cost. In fact, most of the things that are most effective actually are not necessarily related to volume of spending. They're related to the kind of choices that you make and how you define your profession. In fact, again, you know, you take the United States, and what really strikes you when you compare it, first of all, teacher pay is not great. The secondly is teaching hours are high, and non-teaching working time is practically zero. Now you talk about a few hours every week. And I think that kind of combination, then you have small class sizes which drive up costs so that everything becomes expensive, plus a very, very high share of money that never reaches the classroom. And it's those kinds of combination that actually make it harder for teachers to see themselves as protagonists of their profession rather than just sort of implementing established policies and practices. Yeah, first on the first part you mentioned, what I've always been struck, you know, the way you become famous as a teacher in China, Shanghai in particular, is by other people using your knowledge. You know, most teachers would share their lesson plans on an electronic platform. They basically upload them. And the more other teachers comment on your lessons, use your lessons, improve on your lessons, the more popular you're going to become and the better career you're going to have. So actually, it's almost like in academia that, you contribute to the profession and the use by other people. In other fields of life, we do this every day, on Facebook. This is how we rate people, or Amazon, when we buy things, But in education, that culture hasn't really yet arrived, that we basically sort of valued by how we are perceived by the profession. So when teachers move up in their career, they are not tested for their own student knowledge and so on, but they are actually, the way they are respected by their colleagues, by the profession. Some teachers would work for 2-3 years on a single lesson to actually improve it, perfect it, and have other people come in on it. And that actually strengthens the collection. I think the question is a really important one. And actually what you can see is that on the one hand, the national exam, the Gokka in China, has been a great strength of the system. It has kept the system reasonably fair, reasonably equitably, reasonably highly pitched. But it is also sort of not been very good in aligning skill supply with skill demand, and in part you have wave after wave of more and more graduates coming out of the system. And actually, for the first time over the last years, lots of them had real difficulties finding a job. And I think the reform of the entrance exam is a good way to actually improve the match between the skill needs and the supply. The hard part is that you can't easily do these things top down. The question is how those standards will actually be accepted by the profession, how they're going to be accepted by parents, how this kind of stigma of vocational education being a second or third choice is going to be replaced by showing to parents, to students, that actually these are promising ways for their own future. So I think the intended reform is a very, very good approach, but how it's going to be implemented and accepted by the society is, I think, not yet a given. That's, I think, a big question mark. Yeah, it's a good point. In fact, Canada is very, very strong on that. Social background, cultural background do not have much of an impact on learning outcomes. And when you actually see how the system works, you understand why. Because the system sees diversity not as an obstacle to performance. They don't even talk about achievement gap. They see sort of diversity really as the richness of good educational practice. For example, you'd find a lot of curriculum material in Canada that embeds material from the countries of origin of those immigrants, from Pakistan, from India, from China, wherever they come from. Students find their cultural identity reflected in what they learn, not in the learning outcomes. The learning outcomes are actually quite strictly pitched. Everybody's got to learn English, everybody has to do well in mathematics. But in the pathways there's a lot of emphasis to reflect the diversity of the student body. You're also going to see that reflected very interestingly, in the teaching body. Usually the teaching body reflects student demography quite well, so that you actually, and sort of the belief underlying this is that yourself, perceiving yourself as a minority, helps you actually to understand other people, other cultures, other ideas. I think that's sort of a very, very strong approach, strong emphasis on diversity in the student population. Immigrant students, the effort the country makes to actually support the language transition is very, very impressive. I know you have that also in the US, ELL, but there is a lot more emphasis of this in Canada, and the transition is very, very short. Usually in Ontario, every school would have what is called a student success teacher. So someone actually in the school watching out where are the achievement gaps at the level of the individual students, which teacher across the entire spectrum is best positioned to actually contribute to filling that gap. So it becomes a mission of the entire school to engage with this diversity, and with great success. And the only other countries doing similarly well are the Nordic countries in Europe, where also sort of that impact of social context on outcomes is very low. But it goes together, and that's my last point on this, with resources. Those countries actually invest a lot of resources over a very short period in time to actually address those challenges. Yeah, I think that is a very important point. In many high-performing education systems, your mission as a teacher is actually to take care of the cognitive, social, and emotional well-being of the students, to make sure that every student feels valued, every student feels sort of part of the system. The most extreme example of this is Japan, you know. You look at the schedule and you find, oh, teachers teach 16 hours. And then you ask them, oh, what do you do in the rest of your time, you know? I mean, it's such a light job. And then they're going to tell you, you know, I have to call the parents of my students twice per week. I have to go sort of do a lot of student counseling. I have to clean the classroom, the school with my students afterwards. And all of this is part of the pedagogical mission.
Yes.
We are all in this together, and I'm going to take care of you. Last night I mentioned, you know, if you get in trouble with the police in Japan, you know, the police is not going to call your parents, they're going to call your teacher. And basically, you as a teacher are really sort of, and this also puts, as a teacher, you will perceive yourself as losing face if this, but you get the resources to do that, you get the time to do that, and the whole school environment is framed around it. And I think that's a very big strength of if you go to the Nordic countries in Europe, or Germany, in fact, also, you have schools offering social service, health services. It's, as a parent, you know, you don't have to worry, you know, where do I go for what problem, but the school is taking care of your child and is responsible for that.
Yeah, so real quick, what's happening in Poland?
Yeah, Poland is one of the big success stories because it's a system that doesn't have a lot of resources. They did actually two things in the year 1999, and that's why we can measure that so well on the PISA scale, just before the PISA test was initiated. First, they changed the structure of the education system. The Polish system used to have many dead ends in the system where, you know, if you ended up on a particular school type or school, nobody would take care of you. Mm-hmm. They eliminated this, thus increasing the responsibility on schools actually to engage with diversity. Schools could no longer just say, well, you know, I just worry about my AP classes, everybody's going to go, else is going to go to these other tracks. And that made a big impact on the mindset of teachers and schools. You know, I have to solve problems, I can't pass them on to someone else. But secondly, they invested a lot in the profession. I mean, the effort Poland has made to advance teacher training, enhance opportunities for teacher collaboration, increase transparency in the education system has been really, really remarkable. And what it reveals actually, this comes sort of a bit counter to our point on, you know, making teaching more attractive and more selective. They didn't change their teaching force. They worked with the teachers whom they had and basically upgraded pedagogical practice and professional collaboration with the existing teaching force. That in the future is going to make teaching more prestigious, they can make teaching more selective, but I think it's a great example of a country that didn't say, you know, let's wait until a spaceship with new teachers is going to arrive, but let's actually work with the people that we have and actually change what we do. Poland is a really intriguing example of education reform.
This has been fascinating, right?
Thank you very much.
So Andreas is jumping on a plane to New Zealand to meet with the Prime Minister. We wish he could stay another day, but he can't. We are so thankful. Thank you for sharing your insight, your intelligence, and Houston is a better place for it.